The Cheneys made their first West Coast appearance on their book tour at the Nixon Library. Within a week of release, the book shot to the #1 spot on the New York Times bestsellers list. AOC presents comments from his early career in part one of this two-part series.
And ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the Vice President's daughter, who's pretty special in her own right. Vice President of the United States.
He went to Washington, D.C. in 1968 on a congressional fellowship, intending to stay only 12 months. Instead, he ended up devoting 40 years to government service.
Very special place, the Nixon Library. I know how much it means to a lot of us who had an affiliation of one kind or another with the Nixon administration.
I can't imagine any greater blessing than having the opportunity to sit with my dad for several years and talk about his life and learn about his life.
Mr. Cheney related an amusing story of how, as a young man from academia, he came to work for Donald Rumsfeld in the late 1960s, when Rumsfeld became an economic advisor to President Nixon.
But I went in to interview with him, and the interview lasted about 10 minutes. I found myself back out in the hallway. He threw me out. He thought I was some kind of fuzzy-headed academic, and he was right. He said, this isn't going to work, goodbye. And that was the end of the interview. A couple months later, he got nominated by President Nixon to run the anti-poverty program, and the old OEO. And I sat down that night and wrote a memo, about a 12-page memo, telling him how he ought to conduct himself in his confirmation hearings, what he ought to do with the agency once he took over, what his strategy ought to be. So it was a little arrogant of me, but I thought he'd already thrown me out of his office. So I got the memo, went to Don, and I didn't hear anything more until a couple weeks later he got confirmed by the Senate and sworn in. And I got a phone call inviting me to come down and join part of the transition team. Then he looked up at me. He said, you're congressional relations. Now get the hell out of here. And I turned around and walked out. And it took me a minute to figure out what had just happened. He hadn't said, would you like a job? He didn't say, I'm sorry I threw you out the last time.
Mr. Cheney went on to work at the Cost of Living Council during the time when wage freeze and price controls were imposed to address inflation. That experience formed his conservative stance that government controls do not work.
It had a major role in your becoming a conservative, and it helped to shape your view of what the government's role in the economy and in the private sector ought to be.
It was made to impose a freeze on all prices in the economy for 90 days and then move to a more flexible set of controls, sort of work our way back to the free market. I became convinced that no matter how good the intentions might be of people trying to operate that way and use the authority of the government in that fashion, it was a bad idea.
He talked about being a member of the Ford transition team after Nixon resigned and was pardoned.
Talk about your reaction at the time of the pardon and what you've now come to think about it.
It was, needless to say, extraordinarily controversial at the time. In many respects, it's remarkable how public opinion has shifted over the years as more and more people came to realize that what Ford had done with that pardon was exactly the right thing to do. It was very courageous. It may well have cost him re-election, but it was the right thing to do.
For Around and About Orange County, this is Linda Ivanov from the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda.